The morning sun cast long shadows across the concrete courtyard of the Riverside apartment complex in downtown Chicago. Mrs. Henderson was hanging laundry on her third-floor balcony when she heard the most heart-wrenching sound she had ever experienced in her 72 years of life. It was a combination of a terrified yelp and the sickening thud that followed moments later. She dropped the wet shirt she was holding and rushed to the balcony railing, her arthritic hands gripping the metal so tightly her knuckles turned white. What she saw below made her stomach turn and her eyes fill with tears. A small golden retriever lay motionless on the pavement, its beautiful coat now stained with blood. The dog's body was twisted in an unnatural position, and even from 3 floors up, Mrs. Henderson could see that the poor animal was barely breathing. Her eyes immediately shot upward to the 14th floor, where she noticed an elderly man standing on his balcony. He was looking down at the scene below with what appeared to be complete indifference. The man, who she later learned was named Harold Brennan, simply turned around and walked back into his apartment as if nothing had happened. Mrs. Henderson couldn't believe what she was witnessing. How could someone do such a horrible thing to an innocent animal? The dog, whose name was Buddy, had been Harold's companion for nearly 8 years. Neighbors in the building often saw them together during their daily walks around the block. Buddy was known throughout the apartment complex for his friendly nature and wagging tail. Children would often ask their parents if they could pet the beautiful dog, and Harold would usually oblige, though he rarely smiled during these interactions. What the neighbors didn't know was that Harold had been struggling with severe depression and mounting financial problems since his wife's death 2 years earlier. His pension wasn't enough to cover his medical bills and the rising cost of living in the city. The apartment management had recently informed him that his rent would be increasing by $300 per month, money he simply didn't have. On top of these financial worries, Harold had been diagnosed with early-stage dementia, which was affecting his judgment and emotional regulation. The night before the incident, Harold had received another letter from his landlord threatening eviction if he couldn't pay the outstanding balance on his rent. He had been sitting in his worn-out recliner, staring at the stack of unpaid bills on his coffee table, when Buddy approached him looking for attention. The dog had accidentally knocked over a glass of water, soaking some of the important documents. In his confused and frustrated state, Harold had yelled at Buddy and shoved him away. That morning, Harold woke up feeling even more overwhelmed than usual. The walls of his small apartment seemed to be closing in on him, and he felt trapped by circumstances beyond his control. When Buddy started barking at a squirrel on the balcony, something inside Harold snapped. In a moment of complete mental breakdown, he made the unthinkable decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Mrs. Henderson immediately called 911, her voice shaking as she tried to explain the situation to the dispatcher. Within minutes, police sirens could be heard approaching the apartment complex. The first responders included 2 police officers, a paramedic team, and surprisingly, a young Marine named James Rodriguez, who lived in the neighboring building and had heard the commotion. James had been getting ready for his job at the local Veterans Center when he heard Mrs. Henderson screaming for help. Still wearing his civilian clothes but carrying himself with the distinctive posture of a military man, he rushed outside to see what was happening. When he saw Buddy lying on the pavement, his training immediately kicked in. He knelt beside the injured dog and began assessing the situation, his experienced hands checking for signs of life while trying to keep the animal calm and still. James Rodriguez had served 3 tours in Afghanistan as a combat medic before returning to civilian life 2 years earlier. During his time overseas, he had treated countless wounded soldiers and had developed an almost supernatural ability to remain calm under pressure. As he knelt beside Buddy, his trained eyes quickly assessed the dog's injuries. The golden retriever had suffered multiple fractures and internal bleeding, but James could detect a faint pulse and shallow breathing. "Stay with me, boy," James whispered softly, his voice carrying the same gentle tone he had used with wounded soldiers in the field. He carefully positioned his hands to support Buddy's neck and spine, knowing that any wrong movement could cause further damage. The dog's eyes were open but unfocused, and James could see the pain and confusion in them. It reminded him of the look he had seen in the eyes of young soldiers who had been injured in combat, and it broke his heart. The paramedics arrived within minutes and were initially focused on determining if there were any human casualties. When they saw James working with the injured dog, They hesitated. Animals weren't typically part of their emergency response protocol, and they weren't sure how to proceed. James looked up at them with determination in his eyes and said, "I know this isn't standard procedure, but this dog is dying. I've seen enough trauma to know that we have maybe 10 minutes to get him to a veterinary hospital if we want to save his life." One of the paramedics, a woman named Sarah Chen, who had been working emergency response for over a decade, made a quick decision that would later be questioned by her supervisors but ultimately save Buddy's life. She told James that they could transport the dog to the nearest emergency veterinary clinic, which was only about 6 blocks away. It was against protocol, but Sarah had a soft spot for animals and couldn't bear to watch the dog suffer when they had the means to help. While this was happening, the police officers had gone upstairs to question Harold about what had occurred. They found him sitting in his apartment, still in his pajamas, staring blankly at the wall. When they asked him about the incident, Harold initially seemed confused and disoriented. He kept asking where Buddy was and whether it was time for their morning walk. The officers quickly realized that they were dealing with someone who was experiencing significant mental health issues. Detective Maria Santos, who had been called to the scene due to the nature of the incident, had over 15 years of experience dealing with cases involving elderly individuals and mental health crises. She could see that Harold was not fully aware of what he had done. His apartment was in disarray, with unpaid bills scattered everywhere, and very little food in the refrigerator. It was clear that this was a man who had been struggling for some time and had reached a breaking point. James carefully lifted Buddy and placed him on the stretcher that the paramedics had brought. He climbed into the ambulance with Sarah and her partner, refusing to leave the dog's side. During the short ride to the veterinary hospital, James kept his hand on Buddy's chest, monitoring his breathing and heartbeat. He spoke softly to the injured animal, telling him stories about his own dog back home and promising that everything was going to be okay. The veterinary team at Chicago Emergency Animal Hospital had been alerted by radio about the incoming patient. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, the head veterinarian on duty, had treated many cases of animal abuse and neglect over her 20-year career, but she had never seen anything quite like this. When James carried Buddy into the emergency room, she could immediately see the extent of the injuries and knew that surgery would be required immediately if there was any hope of saving the dog's life. James provided Dr. Morrison with all the information he had gathered about Buddy's condition and the circumstances of his injuries. He also gave her his contact information and told her that he would be responsible for any medical expenses that weren't covered by other means. Dr. Morrison was touched by this stranger's dedication to an animal he had never met before, but she warned James that the surgery would be expensive and the outcome was uncertain. The initial examination revealed that Buddy had suffered fractures to his left hind leg and several ribs, along with internal bleeding in his abdomen. Dr. Morrison explained that the next few hours would be critical, and that they would need to operate immediately to stop the internal bleeding and repair the damaged organs. James nodded grimly and asked if he could stay at the hospital during the surgery. Dr. Morrison agreed, sensing that this young man's presence might somehow help Buddy fight for his life. While Buddy was fighting for his life in surgery, James sat in the waiting room of the veterinary hospital, his military training keeping him alert despite the emotional toll of the situation. He had called his supervisor at the Veterans Center to explain why he wouldn't be coming to work that day, and surprisingly, his boss told him to take as much time as he needed. James used this time to make several phone calls, reaching out to local animal rescue organizations and veterans groups that he thought might be able to help with Buddy's medical expenses. Back at the apartment complex, Detective Santos was conducting a thorough investigation into Harold's background and mental state. She discovered that Harold was a retired factory worker who had been struggling financially since his wife Margaret's death from cancer 2 years earlier. Margaret had been Harold's primary caregiver and emotional support system, and her loss had left him completely adrift. The detective also learned that Harold had no close family members in the area and had been increasingly isolated from his few remaining friends. Dr. Morrison and her surgical team worked for over 3 hours to repair Buddy's internal injuries and stabilize his broken bones. The surgery was complicated by the fact that the dog had lost a significant amount of blood and was in shock from the trauma. At one point during the procedure, Buddy's heart stopped beating, and the medical team had to perform CPR to revive him. Dr. Morrison later said that she had never seen a dog fight so hard to survive, and she attributed some of his resilience to the emotional support he seemed to draw from knowing that James was waiting for him. When Dr. Morrison finally emerged from the operating room, she found James pacing nervously in the hallway. She explained that the surgery had been successful in stopping the internal bleeding and repairing the damaged organs, but that Buddy was still in critical condition. The next 24 hours would be crucial in determining whether he would survive his injuries. She also informed James that even if Buddy did survive, he would likely have a permanent limp due to the severity of his leg fractures. James asked if he could see Buddy, and Dr. Morrison led him to the recovery room, where the dog was lying unconscious on a heated blanket, connected to various monitoring equipment. James pulled up a chair beside the small cage and gently placed his hand near Buddy's head, being careful not to disturb the IV lines and monitoring wires. He began talking softly to the unconscious dog, telling him about his own experiences recovering from injuries in military hospitals and how important it was to keep fighting. Meanwhile, Detective Santos had made the difficult decision to arrest Harold on charges of animal cruelty. However, she also arranged for him to be evaluated by a mental health professional at the county hospital, rather than being taken directly to jail. The psychiatric evaluation revealed that Harold was suffering from severe depression, anxiety, and early-stage dementia. The combination of these conditions, along with his financial stress and social isolation, had created a perfect storm that led to his breakdown. News of the incident began to spread throughout the apartment complex and the surrounding neighborhood. Mrs. Henderson, who had witnessed the horrible event, started a petition calling for Harold to face the full consequences of his actions. However, other neighbors who had known Harold for years came forward with stories about his previous kindness toward Buddy and how much he had changed since his wife's death. The community was divided between those who wanted justice for Buddy and those who recognized that Harold needed help rather than punishment. James spent the entire night at the veterinary hospital, sleeping fitfully in the uncomfortable waiting room chair. Every few hours, he would check with the overnight veterinary technician about Buddy's condition. The dog remained unconscious but stable throughout the night, and by morning there were encouraging signs that his vital signs were improving. Dr. Morrison arrived early that morning and was pleased to see that Buddy had made it through the critical first night. When James asked about the total cost of Buddy's medical care, Dr. Morrison presented him with an estimate that made his heart sink. The surgery, hospitalization, medications, and ongoing rehabilitation would cost nearly $8,000. James only had about $1,500 in his savings account, but he didn't hesitate to tell Dr. Morrison that he would find a way to cover the expenses. He had made a promise to Buddy, and he intended to keep it no matter what sacrifices he had to make. Dr. Morrison was deeply moved by James's commitment to an animal he barely knew. She had seen many cases where pets were abandoned at the hospital because their owners couldn't afford treatment, but she had never encountered someone willing to take on such a financial burden for a stranger's pet. She told James that she would work with him to create a payment plan and that she would also reach out to her network of animal welfare organizations to see if they could provide any assistance. On the second day after the incident, Buddy finally began to show signs of consciousness. James was sitting beside his cage when the dog's eyes slowly opened and focused on his face. Buddy tried to lift his head but was too weak from the surgery and medications. James gently stroked the soft fur on Buddy's head and spoke in soothing tones, telling him that he was safe and that everything was going to be all right. For the first time since the incident began, James allowed himself to feel a glimmer of hope. Dr. Morrison was amazed by Buddy's progress and told James that the dog's recovery was exceeding all of her expectations. She attributed much of this success to James's constant presence and emotional support. Studies had shown that animals recover more quickly when they feel loved and cared for, and it was clear that Buddy had formed a strong bond with his rescuer. However, she warned James that the road to full recovery would be long and would require extensive physical therapy and ongoing medical care. While Buddy was beginning his recovery, Harold was undergoing his own form of healing at the county mental health facility. The psychiatrist assigned to his case, Dr. Robert Kim, had extensive experience working with elderly patients suffering from depression and dementia. During their sessions, Harold gradually began to remember what had happened to Buddy, and the realization of what he had done devastated him. He broke down crying and kept repeating that he loved Buddy and never meant to hurt him. Dr. Kim explained to Detective Santos that Harold's actions were the result of a perfect storm of mental health issues, financial stress, and cognitive decline. While this didn't excuse what he had done, it did provide important context for understanding how such a tragic event could occur. Dr. Kim recommended that Harold receive ongoing mental health treatment and support services rather than facing jail time, which would likely only worsen his condition and serve no constructive purpose. James had returned to work at the Veterans Center, but spent every lunch break and evening at the veterinary hospital with Buddy. His colleagues and the veterans he worked with were deeply moved by his story and began organizing fundraising efforts to help cover Buddy's medical expenses. The local VFW post where James was a member held a benefit dinner that raised over $2,000. A local radio station picked up the story and started a campaign that brought in donations from listeners throughout the Chicago area. The story began to gain even more attention when a reporter from the Chicago Tribune wrote an article about James's extraordinary compassion and dedication. The article highlighted not only the rescue effort, but also James's background as a combat veteran who had dedicated his civilian life to helping other veterans readjust to life back home. The story resonated with readers across the country, and donations began pouring in from people who were touched by James's selfless actions. Buddy continued to make steady progress in his recovery. After a week in the hospital, he was able to stand for short periods, though he still required assistance. James worked with the veterinary physical therapist to learn how to help Buddy with his exercises and mobility training. The bond between the two continued to strengthen, and it became clear to everyone at the hospital that they had developed a special relationship that went far beyond the circumstances of their first meeting. Dr. Morrison approached James with a proposal that she had been considering for several days. She explained that while Buddy would eventually be able to live a relatively normal life, he would always have some physical limitations and would require ongoing medical care. Given Harold's mental health issues and uncertain future, she wondered if James would consider permanently adopting Buddy. James had been thinking about the same possibility, but had been hesitant to bring it up, unsure whether it would be appropriate given the circumstances. The legal situation regarding Buddy's ownership was complicated. Harold was still technically the dog's owner, but his arrest and ongoing mental health treatment raised questions about his ability to properly care for an animal. Detective Santos worked with the district attorney's office and animal control authorities to determine the best course of action. They ultimately decided that Harold's case would be handled through the mental health court system, which would focus on getting him the treatment and support he needed, rather than purely punitive measures. When James visited Harold at the mental health facility, it was an emotionally charged meeting for both men. Harold was lucid during the visit and was able to express his deep remorse for what he had done to Buddy. He told James that he knew he could never undo the harm he had caused, but he was grateful that someone like James had been there to save Buddy's life. Harold also said that he wanted Buddy to go to someone who would love and care for him properly, and he believed that James was that person. The meeting lasted for over an hour, during which Harold shared stories about his life with Buddy and his late wife Margaret. He explained how Buddy had been a source of comfort during the darkest period of his life after Margaret's death, which made his actions even more incomprehensible to him. James listened with compassion and understanding, recognizing that Harold was a broken man who had made a terrible mistake during a moment of complete mental breakdown. After 2 weeks of intensive care and rehabilitation, Buddy was finally ready to leave the veterinary hospital. The fundraising efforts organized by James's friends and supporters had not only covered all of Buddy's medical expenses, but had also raised enough money to establish a small fund for his ongoing care. Dr. Morrison was amazed by the outpouring of support from the community and said it restored her faith in humanity's capacity for compassion. James had spent considerable time preparing his apartment for Buddy's arrival. He had installed ramps to help the dog navigate the stairs to his second-floor unit and had purchased all the necessary supplies for caring for a dog with mobility issues. He had also arranged his work schedule at the Veterans Center to allow him to come home during lunch breaks to check on Buddy, and help him with his physical therapy exercises. The day Buddy came home was both joyful and bittersweet. James could see the trust and gratitude in the dog's eyes, but he also noticed that Buddy seemed to be looking around for Harold. Dr. Morrison had warned James that it might take time for Buddy to fully adjust to his new living situation, as dogs form strong attachments to their owners even in cases of abuse or neglect. James was patient and understanding, giving Buddy space to explore his new surroundings at his own pace. Meanwhile, Harold's treatment at the mental health facility was showing positive results. Dr. Kim had prescribed medications to help manage his depression and anxiety, and Harold was participating in group therapy sessions with other elderly patients facing similar challenges. The facility's social worker, Linda Martinez, was also working to connect Harold with community resources that could help him address his financial problems and social isolation once he was released. Detective Santos had been following both Harold's progress and Buddy's recovery with great interest. As someone who had seen many cases of animal abuse throughout her career, she was struck by the unique circumstances of this case and the positive outcome that had emerged from such a tragic beginning. She worked with the district attorney's office to develop a sentencing recommendation that would focus on Harold's rehabilitation rather than punishment. The legal proceedings took place 3 months after the incident. Harold appeared in court accompanied by Dr. Kim and a public defender who specialized in mental health cases. James was also present in the courtroom, along with several supporters who had followed Buddy's story. The judge, Margaret Chen, had reviewed all the psychological evaluations and medical reports, and she clearly understood the complex factors that had led to the incident. Harold stood before the judge and read a prepared statement in which he took full responsibility for his actions and expressed his deep remorse for the pain he had caused Buddy. He also thanked James publicly for saving Buddy's life and providing him with a loving home. There wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom as Harold spoke, his voice breaking with emotion as he described his love for the dog he had injured. Judge Chen sentenced Harold to 2 years of probation, during which he would be required to continue his mental health treatment and perform community service at local animal shelters. She also ordered him to pay restitution to cover Buddy's medical expenses, though this was largely symbolic since the funds had already been raised through community donations. The judge emphasized that Harold's case demonstrated the importance of mental health awareness and the need for better support systems for elderly individuals facing multiple challenges. After the court proceedings, James and Harold met privately in the courthouse hallway. Harold handed James a photo album containing pictures of Buddy throughout his life, from his puppy days with Margaret through their years together after her death. He also gave James Buddy's favorite toy, a worn tennis ball that the dog had carried with him everywhere. Harold told James that seeing Buddy happy and healthy again was the only thing that had given him hope during his darkest moments. The two men shook hands, and Harold asked James to promise that he would send him updates about Buddy's progress. James agreed, understanding that despite everything that had happened, Harold's love for Buddy was genuine, and that staying connected to the dog's well-being would be an important part of Harold's own healing process. They arranged for Harold to write letters to Buddy that James would read to the dog, maintaining a connection that could be therapeutic for both Harold and Buddy. James drove home from the courthouse with mixed emotions. He was relieved that the legal proceedings were finally over and that Harold was receiving the help he needed, but he was also thinking about the long journey that had brought them all to this point. As he pulled into his driveway, he could see Buddy waiting for him at the window, his tail wagging despite his physical limitations. James realized that what had begun as one of the worst days in these 3 lives had somehow transformed into the beginning of something beautiful and healing for all of them. 6 months after Buddy came to live with James, their daily routine had become a source of joy and purpose for both of them. Every morning, James would help Buddy with his physical therapy exercises, gently stretching his injured leg and encouraging him to walk a little further each day. Buddy's progress had been remarkable, and while he still walked with a slight limp, he was able to enjoy many of the activities that dogs love, including short walks around the neighborhood and playing fetch in James's small backyard. The bond between James and Buddy had grown incredibly strong. Buddy seemed to sense when James was having difficult days dealing with his own struggles related to his military service, and he would stay close by, offering comfort through his presence. James, in turn, found that caring for Buddy gave him a sense of purpose that he hadn't experienced since leaving the military. The responsibility of helping another living being heal and thrive had become a crucial part of James's own emotional recovery. Harold had been released from the mental health facility and was living in a subsidized senior housing complex that provided support services for elderly residents. He was continuing his therapy sessions with Dr. Kim and had started volunteering at a local animal shelter as part of his community service requirement. Working with abandoned and abused animals was initially difficult for Harold, as it reminded him of what he had done to Buddy, but it also became an important part of his healing process. True to his promise, James sent Harold regular updates about Buddy's progress, including photos and videos of the dog enjoying his new life. Harold had written several letters to Buddy, which James read aloud to the dog during their quiet evening moments together. In these letters, Harold expressed his love for Buddy and his gratitude to James, and he shared memories of the happy times he and Buddy had experienced together before his mental health crisis. The story of James and Buddy had continued to inspire people throughout the Chicago area and beyond. James was invited to speak at various veterans organizations and animal welfare groups about the healing power of the human-animal bond. He used these opportunities to raise awareness about the mental health challenges faced by both veterans and elderly individuals, emphasizing the importance of community support and early intervention. Dr. Morrison had stayed in touch with James and continued to monitor Buddy's health through regular checkups. She was amazed by the dog's physical and emotional recovery, and often used their story as an example when speaking to veterinary students about the importance of considering the emotional aspects of animal care alongside the medical treatment. Buddy had become something of a mascot at the veterinary hospital, and the staff always looked forward to his visits. James had also connected with Mrs. Henderson, the neighbor who had witnessed the original incident and called for help. She had become like a grandmother figure to both James and Buddy, often inviting them for Sunday dinners and helping to care for Buddy when James had to travel for work. Mrs. Henderson frequently commented that something positive had emerged from the most terrible thing she had ever witnessed, and she credited James's compassion with transforming a tragedy into a story of hope. The relationship between James and Harold had evolved into an unlikely friendship built on their shared love for Buddy. Harold had never had a son, and James's father had died when he was young, so their connection filled an emotional need for both men. They began meeting for coffee once a month, during which Harold would share stories about his life with Margaret and his years with Buddy, while James talked about his military experiences and his work with veterans. During one of these meetings, Harold mentioned that he had been thinking about getting another dog. He felt lonely in his new apartment and believed that caring for a pet might give him a sense of purpose and companionship. James was initially concerned about this idea, given what had happened with Buddy, but Dr. Kim had actually encouraged Harold to consider pet ownership as part of his ongoing therapy. They discussed the possibility of Harold adopting an older, calmer dog that would be easier for him to manage given his physical and emotional limitations. James offered to help Harold choose an appropriate pet and to provide ongoing support to ensure that both Harold and any new dog would be successful together. They visited several animal shelters together, and Harold eventually fell in love with a senior beagle named Charlie, who had been surrendered by a family that could no longer care for him. Charlie was calm, well-trained, and seemed to respond well to Harold's gentle nature. The adoption process was carefully managed, with input from Dr. Kim, the animal shelter's behavioral specialist, and James. They established a support system that included regular check-ins, training resources, and emergency contacts in case Harold ever felt overwhelmed. The adoption was successful, and Harold found that caring for Charlie gave him the companionship and purpose he needed, while also providing him with an opportunity to demonstrate that he could be a loving and responsible pet owner. 2 years after the incident that brought them together, James and Buddy had become inseparable companions, whose story continued to touch lives throughout their community and beyond. Buddy had made a complete emotional recovery and had adapted remarkably well to his physical limitations. His slight limp had become barely noticeable, and his joyful spirit had returned in full force. More importantly, Buddy had learned to trust again, demonstrating the incredible resilience that animals possess when they are shown love and patience. James had found his calling in working with both veterans and rescue animals. He had started a non-profit organization called Second Chances that connected military veterans with rescue dogs, particularly those that had been abused or neglected. The program provided training and support for both the veterans and the animals, recognizing that the healing process worked both ways. James's own experience with Buddy had taught him that sometimes the act of saving another living being was exactly what someone needed to find their own path to recovery. Harold's transformation had been equally remarkable. His work with Charlie and his volunteer activities at the animal shelter had given him a new lease on life. He had become an advocate for elderly individuals facing mental health challenges and often spoke at community centers about the importance of seeking help before reaching a crisis point. Harold's relationship with Charlie was completely different from his relationship with Buddy had been. He was more mindful of his emotional state and had developed coping strategies to manage stress and depression before they became overwhelming. The friendship between James and Harold had deepened over time, and they had become an unlikely but powerful team in advocating for both animal welfare and mental health awareness. They often appeared together at community events, sharing their story and emphasizing that healing and redemption were possible even after the most tragic circumstances. Their message resonated particularly strongly with audiences because it demonstrated that people could change and grow, even after making terrible mistakes. Buddy had become something of a local celebrity, and his story had been featured in national media outlets as an example of the power of compassion and second chances. However, James was careful to protect Buddy from too much attention, ensuring that the dog's well-being remained the top priority. Buddy seemed to enjoy meeting new people and had an almost intuitive ability to sense when someone needed comfort, making him a perfect therapy dog for James's work with veterans. The veterinary hospital where Buddy had been treated had established the Buddy Fund to help other animals in similar situations receive the medical care they needed regardless of their owner's ability to pay. Dr. Morrison served on the fund's board of directors alongside James, and they had been able to help dozens of injured and abused animals receive life-saving treatment. The fund had become a lasting legacy of Buddy's story and a testament to the power of community support. Mrs. Henderson continued to play an important role in all of their lives, serving as a bridge between different generations and backgrounds. She often reflected on how the worst thing she had ever witnessed had somehow led to some of the most beautiful relationships and positive changes she had seen in her community. Her apartment had become a gathering place for their extended family of choice where Harold, James, Buddy, and Charlie would come together for holidays and special occasions. The impact of their story had reached far beyond their immediate community. James regularly received messages from people around the country who had been inspired by Buddy's recovery and the unlikely friendship between James and Harold. Many of these messages came from veterans struggling with their own challenges, elderly individuals feeling isolated and forgotten, and animal lovers who had been motivated to volunteer or donate to rescue organizations. On the second anniversary of the day they met, James took Buddy back to the apartment complex where everything had begun. Mrs. Henderson joined them, and together they stood in the courtyard where Buddy had almost lost his life. Instead of being a place of trauma, it had become a symbol of resilience, forgiveness, and the incredible capacity for healing that exists within all living beings. Buddy showed no signs of distress or fear. Instead, he seemed to understand that this was where his new life had truly begun. James looked down at Buddy, whose tail was wagging as he watched children playing in the courtyard, and reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. What had started as the worst day in 3 lives had become the foundation for a story of hope, healing, and the transformative power of unconditional love. James knew that he had saved Buddy's life that terrible morning, but he also understood that Buddy had saved his life in return, giving him a purpose and a sense of meaning that he had been searching for since returning from military service. The story of James, Buddy, and Harold had become a powerful reminder that even in our darkest moments, there is always the possibility for redemption, healing, and new beginnings. Their unlikely family had shown their community and countless others that compassion and second chances could transform lives in ways that no one could have imagined. As they walked home together that day, James knew that their story was far from over and that the best chapters were still being written. One day of love, healing, and hope at a time.